In 2022, an airborne laser survey called LiDAR swept across roughly 4,500 square kilometers of the Llanos de Mojos in lowland Bolivia and exposed 26 ancient settlements that had been sitting under Amazon rainforest canopy for over 1,000 years. No textbook description of the Amazon as untouched wilderness accounts for what turned up in that data. Stepped earthen platforms, arrow-straight causeways, and engineered reservoirs built by a society archaeologists had barely named until recently. The tallest platform, at a site called Cotoca, rises roughly 22 meters above the surrounding plain, built entirely from packed earth, sitting at the center of a network of raised roads that run in straight lines for kilometers at a stretch. This wasn't a scattered camp. It was a planned landscape. Over the next few minutes, we're going to walk through what LiDAR and decades of soil science have actually confirmed beneath one of the most studied rainforests on Earth. And by the end, you'll understand why the untouched Amazon you picture in your head might not be untouched at all, but the overgrown ruins of something far more deliberate. Here's what we actually know about that Bolivian survey. It was led by the German archaeologist Heiko Prumers and published in the journal Nature in 2022. And it focused on a culture now called Casarabe, which occupied the region from roughly 500 to 1400 years ago. The scan revealed two major population centers, Cotoca and Landivar, each surrounded by smaller satellite settlements connected by causeways that in some cases stretch for several kilometers in perfectly straight alignments. Canals and artificial reservoirs sit alongside the platforms, suggesting water management on a scale that has no place in the old model of small, mobile forest bands. That old model has a name, and it deserves some scrutiny. The name is the counterfeit paradise hypothesis, proposed by the American archaeologist Betty Meggers back in 1971. Meggers argued that Amazonian soils were simply too poor in nutrients to support anything beyond small, scattered, semi-nomadic populations. That the rainforest's lushness was a kind of illusion masking fundamentally weak ground. For decades, this became the default explanation taught in classrooms, and it's worth asking directly whether a theory built on the assumption that a tropical population couldn't have built complex societies without European-style agriculture was ever really about the soil at all, or about who got to be called civilized. That's a claim worth arguing about in the comments, because the physical evidence increasingly says Meggers had the causation backwards. The clearest rebuttal sits literally in the dirt, in patches known as terra preta, or Amazonian dark earth. This is a documented human-made soil, dark, dense with charcoal, broken pottery, bone, and organic waste, deliberately built up by pre-Columbian populations over generations of habitation. Unlike the naturally thin, acidic soils typical of the region, terra preta stays fertile for centuries after the people who made it are gone, in some studied patches remaining productive more than 500 years after abandonment. Officially, the explanation is simple. Ancient farmers improved their land. The problem is that modern soil scientists still haven't fully reverse-engineered the exact process well enough to replicate its long-term potency at scale. The Dutch soil scientist Wim Sombroek was among the first researchers to seriously document and name terra preta in the mid-20th century, cataloging its distribution in patches near Manaus and scattered through the Xingu Basin. These patches range from small garden-sized plots to sites covering several square kilometers each, and estimates of how much of the total Amazon basin they cover remain genuinely contested. Some researchers put the aggregate area at under 1%. Others argue the true extent is still undermapped because so much sits beneath dense, unsurveyed canopy. That's where the documented trail on total scale stops, and where the disagreement between soil scientists actually lives. But here's the detail that doesn't fit the old picture at all. In 2017, a team led by the ecologist Carolina Levis published a study in the journal Science examining which tree species dominate today's Amazon forests. They found that species long domesticated by humans, Brazil nut, cacao, acai, and dozens of others, are disproportionately concentrated near known pre-Columbian altercation sites, far more than random distribution would predict. If topics like ancient landscapes hiding in plain sight interest you, this is exactly the kind of channel that keeps digging past the textbook version, So it's worth sticking around for what comes next, because this finding means the forest's own species composition may be a kind of fossil record of deliberate planting. What the data doesn't explain is how consistently this pattern holds. Levis and her colleagues found that domesticated species were roughly 5 times more likely to be among the forest's hyper-dominant trees, the relatively small number of species that make up the bulk of all trees across the entire Amazon basin, than non-domesticated ones. In other words, huge stretches of what looks like untouched jungle are still, in effect, growing according to an orchard layout planted by people who died centuries before European contact. Researchers have not fully explained why some of these patterns extend so far beyond any single settlement's likely footprint, and why the effect is strongest in exactly the regions where terra preta and earthworks also cluster. This is where most explanations quietly stop, but LiDAR kept finding more structure elsewhere. In the eastern Brazilian state of Acre, cattle ranchers who cleared rainforest for pasture beginning in the 1970s started noticing geometric shapes cut into the exposed ground. Perfect squares, circles, and hexagons, some connecting to each other along raised causeways. Researchers including the Brazilian archaeologist Denise Schahn and the Finnish archaeologist Martti Parsinen have since documented several hundred of these geoglyphs, with radiocarbon dating placing construction at various points between roughly the year 0 and the 1200s. The leading hypothesis is that these were ceremonial or gathering enclosures, though their precise function remains undocumented in any surviving written or oral record, because no written language from these cultures has survived to explain them. Further north, in the Upper Xingu region, the American archaeologist Michael Heckenberger spent years mapping what he came to call garden cities among the ancestors of today's Kuikuro people. His surveys documented planned settlements with defensive ditches, wide plazas, and road networks connecting clusters of villages across the landscape in patterns that imply coordinated regional planning rather than isolated communities. Population estimates for this network remain a genuine point of contention among archaeologists. Some researchers propose figures in the tens of thousands for the region, while others argue the evidence supports far smaller numbers, and there is no scientific consensus on which estimate is closer to correct. How large the pre-contact population of the Amazon basin actually was has never been settled, and it may never be, given how much physical evidence has already been erased by 5 centuries of forest regrowth and modern land use. That should have settled the question of whether the Amazon was pristine or engineered. It didn't, because the most unsettling implication of all this evidence isn't about the past. It's about what we're looking at right now. When European contact began in the early 1500s, diseases introduced from across the Atlantic swept through indigenous populations across the Americas with devastating speed. And researchers have estimated that Amazonian populations may have declined by somewhere in the range of 80 to 90% within a few generations, though exact figures remain difficult to pin down given how few written records exist from the region during that period. Entire networks of cities, farms, and managed forests would have lost the people maintaining them almost simultaneously. What the data doesn't explain, and what may be the single strangest fact in this entire story, is this: the untouched rainforest that later European and American explorers described with such awe, the one still pictured today as humanity's last truly wild place, may not have been wilderness reclaiming itself from nothing. It may have been abandoned infrastructure being swallowed by 500 years of unmanaged regrowth. The garden cities, the causeway networks, the orchards planted with hyper-dominant species, all of it left to grow over without anyone tending it. Until the forest that grew back looked, to later eyes, like it had never been touched at all. No one disputes that population collapse happened. It's the scale of what was lost with it that causes the argument. So where does the evidence actually leave us? Here's what's genuinely proven. The LiDAR survey over the Llanos de Mojos is real, peer-reviewed, and confirms large-scale earthen construction under canopy that was, until recently, assumed to be empty forest. Terra preta is a real, chemically documented anthropogenic soil, still measurably more fertile than the surrounding ground centuries after it was made. The Levi's study on hyperdominant domesticated trees is published and replicated. What remains genuinely unresolved is the total population these societies once supported, the exact techniques used to produce Terra Preta's long-term fertility, and how many more Kotoka-scale settlements are still sitting undetected beneath the roughly 80% of the Amazon basin that has never been surveyed by LiDAR at all. So think again about that platform at Kotoka, rising 22 meters over a landscape most of us were taught to picture as empty. It isn't a ruin standing apart from the jungle around it. The jungle around it is the ruin, still growing, still quietly holding the shape of the hands that built it. Somewhere under the unmapped 80% of this rainforest, there may be another Kotoka, another causeway, another orchard nobody planted on purpose in this generation. And until someone flies a laser over it, we won't have any way of knowing it's there at all.